In this video, we're going to take a look at the effect downward wage rigidity has in the labor market and its effect on output. Additionally, I want to talk about the causes of downward wage rigidity. So just to recap, we have some markets where we have flexible wages, or labor markets where we have flexible wages, meaning when there's a decrease in demand for labor, the market wage is allowed to decrease. There's nothing restraining it from decreasing. Therefore, we see a decrease in the amount of people employed and the wage rate. The market clears, so quantity demand of labor is going to be equal to quantity supply of labor. When there is downward wage rigidity, when there's a decrease in demand for labor, the wage cannot decrease. It leads to more people being unemployed, a lower level of unemployment, because the downward rigid wage intersects the new labor demand curve at a quantity that's less than the intersection of supply and demand when wages are able to be flexible. So the number of people is going to be lower, the number of people employed is going to be lower when wages are rigid, because the quantity demanded essentially is going to be lower at a higher rate, at a higher wage rate. So what is this, or what causes this downward wage rigidity? Well, there's a couple different sources of it. One, minimum wage laws. Minimum wage laws are just price floors on wages, meaning the wage rate can't go below a certain rate, a certain level. Okay? Additionally, labor unions and collective bargaining agreements, where those members in the union maybe argue a higher rate. Well, if the market rate suddenly decreases and there's a contract in place that prevents wages being paid lower than what was negotiated, and that market rate is below that negotiated level, then we're going to see some inefficiencies in the labor market, because quantity supplied is going to be greater than quantity demanded at those higher prices. Okay. And additionally, sometimes workers just pay, or firms just pay workers higher wages to incentivize production. We call these efficiency wages. Importantly, with minimum wage laws, if we look at them in two different markets, if we look at them in the low skilled workers market and a high skilled market, we're just differentiating between markets where you have higher wages and lower wages. Typically in low skill workers markets, you're going to have lower wages. So, a high minimum wage is going to have more of an effect, or more of a source of inefficiency in a labor market with low skill or lower wages, because it's going to be more constraining, more imposing, meaning the high minimum wage rate is going to be further above what the equilibrium wage rate would be. Whereas in some labor markets where the wage rate is high enough, if you have a low enough minimum wage, it's not going to affect the equilibrium wage rate, because the equilibrium wage rate is higher than the minimum wage rate. So really, when we're concerned about inefficiencies in labor markets due to minimum wage laws, it's going to be in markets where the wage rate is relatively lower, which is exactly the markets where it makes sense to impose minimum wage rates. So the takeaway is, yeah, minimum wage does a lot of good, and you can argue whether it's too high or too low, but the good that the minimum wage does is at a cost, and the cost is some inefficiencies in the labor market. Okay? So when we look at the labor market and its relationship to output, well, we can do this. We can actually model this relationship using the aggregate production function and the aggregate labor market. So if we look at these graphs here on the top, we have our aggregate labor market. on the bottom here, we have our aggregate production function. Importantly, on the x-axis of both these graphs is the amount of employment, the quantity of labor. So the reason these graphs are stacked on top of each other is because the x-axis is measuring the exact same thing. Therefore, when we see a decrease in the demand for labor in the labor market, yes, it's going to reduce employment and drive down the wage rate, but its effect on the aggregate production function can be seen by the initial input level of labor. Well, that's at this initial equilibrium before the decrease in demand for labor. Well, we can see that intersects the aggregate production function right at this point here. So this would be like if, let's say, initially the equilibrium amount of labor, let's call this Q1, is equal to, I don't know, 11 billion hours of employment. Well, that means that this endpoint here is going to be, we'll call it Q1 equal to 11, and that's going to result in some real GDP that's relatively high, call it real GDP1. Well, when there's that decrease, what's going to happen? Again, quantity of labor is going to decrease. Let's say it drops down to like 9 billion hours. Well, when that occurs, the increase or the input into the aggregate production function that has labor on the x-axis and capital being held constant, well, that labor input's now reduced to 9 billion hours, which is going to reduce real GDP. This is going to reduce output to some value. Okay? So what's happening is, the decrease in the demand for labor is going to lead to less people being employed, which is going to lead to less of a labor input, which is going to drive down output. Now, this is when wages are flexible. If wages are rigid, downwardly rigid, well, this problem is exacerbated, meaning that, yeah, we're going to see the same decrease in the demand for labor, but now the number of people employed is even lower. Before, it was something, I think we said it was at, it decreased to like 9 billion hours. This was Q2. Now call this Q3. Put it down here. Q3 is something even lower. Let's call it like 6 billion hours worked. Well, if that's the case, now our input for labor is going to be even lower than where it was with flexible wages. And it's going to cause real GDP to see an even bigger decrease. It was initially up here. I'm doing a different color here. It was initially higher. Now, before the decrease in demand for labor, now the decrease in demand for labor is even larger than what the decrease in output is even larger than what the decrease in output was when wages were flexible. So when we have downward wage rigidity in the labor market, it causes a larger decrease in output when there's a negative shock to the labor market, to the demand for labor. So this decrease here, this decrease in the labor market, we call that a negative shock to the labor market. Okay? So when that occurs, the labor market absorbs that negative shock a little bit more when wages are flexible. Hence, employment doesn't fall as much than when wages are rigid.